I'm going to begin by saying that because the history of Marxism in the 20th century has been fantastically distorted by Stalinism, it's important to start by saying that the whole history of the revolutionary Marxist tradition is a tradition of a battle for democracy. Marx, the young Marx, was the most radical democrat you can imagine. One of his very early letters to a friend of his called Arnold Ruge, he writes that since the Greeks, the principle has decayed from the world. It is what he calls the principle of the self-confidence of the human being, or freedom. And he says our job, he says, the radical democrat, even before he became a communist, is to revive that spirit of the self-confidence of the human being, freedom. Now, Marx, as I said, was a radical democrat before ever he was a communist, and it was because he was a radical democrat that he became a communist. Because when he discovered the property question, he realized the only solution to the property question is that people should also control economic life democratically. And that was the beginning of his communism. And his ideas, and the ideas of Marxism about democracy have developed. They haven't been static from the beginning, they've developed in the light of the experience of the workers' struggle. So if you read Marx in the early 1850s, living in England with Engels, he's terribly enthusiastic about the demands of the Chartists, which were basically about reform of Parliament, about getting the franchise, the suffrage, the vote. And he sees that as a solution to the problem of the workers' movement well, we don't know what he was thinking during the 1850s and 1860s, but then he changed his mind in 1871 with a fantastic advance by the Parisian workers in the Paris Commune when they developed make a huge leap forward in practical democracy. And he says, now, we have to forget everything we thought before. We have to be absolutely clear. You have to overthrow the state. The principle of the existing state stands in the way of the realization of freedom, of democracy. Why? For a number of reasons, which I'll say something about. But first of all, what does he celebrate in the Paris Commune is the principle that every official is elected. Every official should be subject to recall. Not for 5 years, like your modern MP, but subject to immediate recall if the people who elected them don't like them, and they shouldn't get any privileges, they should receive the average worker's pay. And he says, what a brilliant principle. In the future, this is where we should go. And Engels, looking back at the Paris Commune, says, if you want to know what the dictatorship of the proletariat means, look at the Paris Commune. What does working class rule mean? It means that form of democracy. Now, what's the argument against parliamentary democracy in this light? It is not that we're against it, that we want to go backwards. We want to go forwards beyond it because it isn't democratic enough. Let's think of several reasons why. The first reason, most of the state is not elected. Who elected the police chief who organised the policing of Glen Eagles? Not us, not the people. We do not elect the police. We don't elect the judges. We don't elect the senior civil servants who send asylum seekers back to Zimbabwe. We don't elect the people who sent us to war. We don't elect the generals. We don't elect the officers in the army. You can go on and on. Most of the state, the apparatus of the state, is not elected. So that's the first reason it's not democratic. Second reason it's not democratic is that after the little bit that is democratic, the parliament, after we've elected them, we have that moment of freedom when we elect the MP, and then they fall out of our control. Even if they're George Galloway, they fall out of our control. We can't recall George Galloway. We might have a word with him as a comrade and say, George, we don't quite like what you said about that, but we can't recall him. Even George Galloway is not, in that sense, subject to recall by us. Okay? Even the best MP is not subject to recall, and the worst, of course, are not. Ever. And the third is that there's a whole area of life which is completely excluded from democracy, and it's called the economy. You may have your moment of freedom in the ballot box, but then the next day, after you've been to the boat in the morning, you then go to work and you discover there's somebody else you didn't elect who also has a massive control over your life. It's called the boss. And the boss is also, the whole world of the economy is run by the rich, etc. No democracy at all. So what is communism about? It's expanding democracy to cover everything. So the principle of revolutionary democracy is that everything should be under the control of the people. Now, the Commune solved the first, I said there were three problems with parliamentary democracy. The Commune solved the first two. It said all officials should be elected and they should be subject to recall. But they didn't solve the problem of economic life. Basically, if you look at the history of the Commune, although I believe Donny Gluckstein's about to publish a book showing that I'm wrong about this, as far as I know, in terms of what I know about the Paris Commune, there was very little in the way of the social question posed in the Paris Commune. If you read Marx on the Paris Commune, the only question which they raised was stopping night work for bakers, which is very good. Bakery workers shouldn't work at night. But all the other questions about economic life, about how the workshop should be run, the factory should be run, about how the neighbourhood should be organised, how town planning should be organised, all those things are not dealt with by the Commune. So the further advances have still to be made, and they're made after Marx and Engels die, really from the beginning of the 20th century. And the reason is because of the enormous development in the class struggle, the enormous development in the size and capacity of the working class that we see in the modern working class of the 20th century. Because one of the interesting things about the Paris Commune is the average size of workplaces in Paris, according to one thing I read, was less than 10 workers. Now, your average primary school employs more people than that, right? So, very small workplaces. So, understandably, a different form of organisation is adopted by Parisian workers based on the neighbourhood from what workers start developing in the 20th century, which is the century of mass strikes, of factory occupations, and so on and so on. Something which is not really known to workers in the 19th century. The first time it appears, a new form of organisation, is 100 years ago, this year, in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, in the first Russian Revolution, the rehearsal for the 1917 revolution. Workers invent a new form of organisation. The Russian word for it is the Soviet. It simply means council, the Workers' Council. And that is something that we see appearing time and again in the course of the 20th century, and now I'm happy to say we see it being wanted in the beginning of the 21st century in Bolivia once again. The question is being posed once again of workers' control, workers' power, workers' self-government being posed in El Alto as a demand in the 21st century, exactly 100 years after Petrograd. And it's very exciting to see that, because it means that our tradition is bursting forth yet again as a demand of the workers. Still only a demand, not an actuality in Bolivia, but we have to hope that they will make that breakthrough. Now, what I really want to do is spend a little time talking about the form and significance of the Workers' Council. And that's what I'm going to spend most of my time talking, in fact, all the rest of my time talking about. And I really want to divide it up into 5 parts. The first one is to recognise that the Workers' Council is not something that is kind of sucked out of people's thumbs and quite separately from the class struggle. It emerges as a natural form of organisation of workers at a particular point in the development of the class struggle. What you need to think about, if you want to think how does a Workers' Council get formed, is you have to think, what would an extended strike committee look like? Or, if you're in the army or the navy, what would an extended mutiny committee look like? Because sometimes that's the key question. See, let's begin with Petrograd, 1905. How does it all begin? A group of printing workers in one factory go on strike, demanding that they should be paid wages for punctuation marks as well as for letters. It seems an extraordinary thing that a great workers' movement should begin with. That was the demand of the print workers in this factory. We wanted to be paid for full stops and commas as well as letters when we typesetting. Their strike spread to other factories, first to other print shops, then to other workers, then to other centres across Russia. The strike spread, the demands expanded, obviously beyond the punctuation marks. And then there was a meeting out of this struggle, as this developed in the autumn of 1905, a group of Mensheviks, not Bolsheviks, a group of Mensheviks, 30 or 40 Mensheviks from different factories met together, and they issued a call for workers to support a political general strike. In other words, they're not quite like Labour right-wingers, these Mensheviks. And secondly, they invited workers to send delegates to a new body they were establishing called a council, a Soviet. They said, come, send delegates to a council so we can organise the political general strike against the Tsar really effectively. Now, that's a brilliant initiative, but, you know, I actually once attempted to form a workers' council in Manchester, and we didn't get the response that the Petrograd workers got, these Menshevik workers got in 1905. They got a fantastic response from the workers of Petrograd who thought, that is a brilliant idea, we'll do the same. We'll send delegates from our workplaces to this council. The Bolsheviks, very interesting this, the Bolsheviks' initial reaction was, the Mensheviks have called this deeply suspicious. What's all this about? We're not sure about this. Lenin had to argue with them, we've got to back this. because, you know, we didn't start it, can't be right. You know, we've all been there, haven't we? In the end, what were the figures? There were 562 delegates were sent to the Petrograd Soviet from 147 workplaces, and a few others from a few trade unions and so on. In other words, it really became a representative body of large sections of the Petrograd working class. And what workers identified, the workers came to call it our government, the workers' government. Their opponents called it the workers' government. It was crushed militarily in the end. Trotsky, who became its president, was arrested, and the whole thing was dissolved in December 1905. It was defeated. But came the 1917 revolution 12 years later. As soon as the revolution began, the workers of Petrograd recreated their own the Soviet. They'd already done it once, they had the memory of how to do it, and they did it again. You see exactly the same thing happen in Poland in 1980 when they created an inter-factory strike committee. It was just the same thing under another name. Did just what it said on the tin note, it's just the same thing, and they'd already done it in 1970. They created inter-factory strike committees. So when workers have done something once, and they have the memory in their guts, this is what we did last time, it's easier to do it again. And they did it again in 1917, and they formed the Soviet once again, and of course as a result there was created in Russia a situation which was famously dubbed dual power, which was a situation where on the one hand you had the power of the provisional government, the bourgeois government, on the other hand, opposed to that, the power of the organized workers, and now it was also the organized soldiers, because they had their own councils affiliated with the workers' councils, and the peasants. As the peasant struggle developed, they also developed parallel organizations and linked up with workers. And there are these clash of two powers, the dual power situation, and the Bolsheviks calling from the spring onwards, saying that the only solution to this was for the Soviets to take power. And of course the 1917 revolution, the October Revolution, was carried out in the name of Soviet power. And that's what we celebrate in the Russian Revolution, of course, that it was this new kind of democratic organization of the ordinary people had taken power for the first time in history. Move on 1 year later and go to Germany, and you see, I said it isn't always a strike committee, a mutiny committee in this case, amongst the sailors of Kiel harbour, where they were ordered at the end of the war to go to put their ships to sea against the British Navy, which they knew would sink them and drown the lot, because they would be hopelessly outgunned. And they mutinied. At the end of the war, that ended the war, in fact. They mutinied. They knew that if they were to succeed in their mutiny, if they weren't all going to be shot for mutinying, they would have to spread their mutiny. They formed a sailors' council. They appealed to the workers of Kiel in the local factories to join them in a sailors and workers' council, and then they sent delegates down the coast and around Germany saying, join us, we form councils, end the war. And the result was, within days, the Kaiser was overthrown, the war was ended, the First World War was ended with the German Revolution. Again, there was a situation created of dual power in Germany, with a parliament supported by the Social Democrats and a workers' council movement, the RAT, as it was called, a lovely word, the RAT, was the German word for council. The Soviet, it's another word, same word, the RAT, the German RAT, the Reta. The German, in the conflict of dual power between the councils and the parliamentary government, alas, because of the weakness of the left, there isn't time to go into it. Actually, the council movement was finally defeated, and bourgeois democracy was installed on a very shaky basis, which prepared the way for Hitler. We see it again. We see it in Spain in 1936, in the Spanish Revolution, the formation of workers' and peasants' councils, in Barcelona and in Aragon and elsewhere. In 1956, at the time of the Hungarian Revolution, when the workers of Budapest formed the Central Workers' Council of Budapest, which linked together all the factories, not during the uprising, but after the uprising, when the Russians came in, the workers were still organizing themselves, and they negotiated, or attempted to negotiate, with the Russian invader. And again, they formed the same form of organization, an inter-factory committee of delegates from all over Budapest, and the Greater Budapest. In Chile, in 1972, a year before the fall of Allende, workers formed an organization called the Cordon, which means simply the industrial belt, the belt. And it was something which linked together industrial workers and agricultural workers. You didn't have to be a member of a union to belong to a cordon. It organized both the unorganized workers, the untrade union organized workers, and the organized workers into a single organization. Tragically, of course, the cordons were defeated and crushed in the bloody destruction of the Chilean revolution by Pinochet, who we're very pleased to see being charged at last for his crimes now in Chile. But in 1973, the terrible bloodshed in Chile, they were crushed. Perhaps the most impressive post-war development of workers' councils, without them knowing it, without them having the name, was in Poland in 1980 in the formation of Solidarity in Poland. What they formed in the basis of Solidarity was a form of organization called the Inter-Factory Strike Committee. Again, we have a situation, and I'll come back to this, I'll say a little bit more about it later, but we see in Poland a body called the Inter-Factory Strike Committee in Gdansk, which then spreads as a form to other cities, which organizes all workers, irrespective of trade, based on delegates from different factories who then come together to combine all their forces to negotiate with the government, combining political and economic demands as we see regularly in the history of every significant workers' council movement. Lastly, in terms of the 20th century, very important development in France in 1995. You notice I have not mentioned 1968 in France because there weren't workers' councils in the great French events of 1968. Workers were isolated in their different factories, largely. They occupied their factories, but they didn't link up. What was impressive about 1995 was that postal workers and railway workers and other workers began to form new kinds of organizations in their strike movement in 1995 called coordinations. Same thing. Workers' council beginning to emerge, something which combines together workers of different industries to discuss their common problems, form common demands, and so on. It was the beginning of, because of the reduction in the influence of the Communist Party, there was this space created in which now workers could begin to march forward again. Okay, let's notice a couple of things about this just before we move on. The first is that parties do not create these bodies. Movements create them. Workers' movements create them out of the necessities of the movement. The second thing, they're products of the immediate struggle. They're not called by parties. They're multi-party. They're multi-tendency. They seek to organize all workers, regardless of their trade, regardless of their opinion. If you agree with the struggle, you should be sending a delegate to our body, is what they say. It's an organization which is the ultimate development, if you like, of the need for workers' unity and solidarity. Now, that's the first thing, my first point. The second point is that we see at its best in these forms of organization the height of democracy. These are bodies which develop the very principles of the commune. Once again, everybody's elected based on delegates elected from different workplaces and neighborhoods and so on. Everybody's recallable. And the principle of recallability is something we're not used to. But there's a very nice illustration. There's an article by John Reed about the Soviet in Russia, where he describes how the composition of the Soviet could change overnight. In December 1917, after the victory of the Soviet Revolution, the Petrograd Soviet was necessarily involved in a big dispute going on in Russia about whether there should be a constituent assembly or whether the Soviet should rule. And quite a lot of workers still supported the constituent assembly. And there was a demonstration through Petrograd in support of the constituent assembly. And some of the Red Guards, stupidly, fired on the crowd, right? Fired on the Mensheviks. The result immediately, there was outrage amongst wide layers of Russian workers. This is not what we fought the revolution for. That is not how we should be settling questions. And 12 Bolsheviks, within 12 hours, 12 Bolsheviks had lost their credentials for the Soviet and were replaced by Mensheviks. It took them 3 weeks to get their positions back. Now, you think if we had had such a principle in the run-up to the Iraq War, as the opinion changes, so Parliament changes, we'd never have gone through Iraq. We wouldn't have anybody in Iraq because the build-up of opinion, you remember how it built up as we were going towards war, the 2 million demonstration, the numbers that represented, we would not have gone to war with Iraq. Long live the democracy of the Soviet, and what a help it would have been to the people of Iraq. Let's get there quickly. The germ of this, though, one other example in Gdansk, just something I picked up, one thing I was reading. One factory sent its delegate to the Inter-Factory Strike Committee meetings at the shipyard, the Lenin shipyard, where they were all meeting. And when he came home in the evening, he went to the pub. And he got completely pissed, and his fellow workers found him in this bar with his credentials lying on the table in a pool of beer, And they sacked him on the spot and sent somebody else the next day, saying, "We cannot possibly be represented by somebody who behaves in such an outrageous way with our delegation," right? Changed them very quickly, under the necessities of the moment. Always the necessities of the moment combine with the question of democracy to drive this form of organisation forward. But the germ of it, you can see the germ of such forms of organisation in a well-elected, well-organised strike committee. If you've ever been in a well-organised strike committee, which possibly not a lot of workers these days have been, but a well-organised strike where the rank and file is in control, where there are regular meetings between the stewards and the rank and file and so on, you get that same sense of the link, the locking together of the base and the leadership, in a sense, in a really strong dialectical relationship. And you can see the democratic possibilities in Gdansk in the Interfactory Strike Committee, because in 1917 they didn't have modern technology. In 1980, when they negotiated with the government, they forced the government to send delegates to the shipyard, send a representation to the shipyard to negotiate with them. And a little tiny group was elected to negotiate with the government. And you think, immediately, hang on, they're going to be negotiating. What are they going to say? Okay, right, I'm going to have to speed up. I'm nowhere near what I was going to say in my time. Okay, quickly. What did they do? They had microphones on the table with the little group negotiating with the government, so that all the rest of the delegates in the big hall next door could hear every word that was spoken. The whole thing was tape recorded. In fact, you can read a transcript of the entire negotiations. If you dialed the right number on an international exchange, you could actually listen to the negotiations going on in America, going on in Gdansk on a phone in America if you spoke Polish. They played them on the tannoy to the rest of the shipyard, and they played them out into the square outside the gates of the factory, so that the crowds that were assembled out there could hear the negotiations going on. And what's more, every time one of the government representatives said something that people didn't like, that when they lied, for example, the entire crowd would boo, and the negotiations would hear the boos of the crowd or the applause when their side made good points and so on. Very democratic. Imagine having trade union negotiations like that, instead of your trade union leaders going off to a secret hotel to have negotiations with their employers. Okay, so that's the second thing, the democracy. Third thing, this is the means by which workers overcome a crucial division which exists within our movement, between politics on the one side and economics on the other. Because in real life, politics and economics are not separated, but they are within bourgeois society. Politics is over here, economics and social life is over here. What do we see regularly in the history of workers' movements? The interplay between economic and political demands. The Russian workers in 1905 had two demands: the 8-hour day and the gun. Now, that is a fantastic combination of economics and politics. In 1980, the workers of Gdansk, when they formed the Interfactory Strike Committee, their demands included pay rises, improvements in the health service, the right to have free trade unions, stop censoring the church's religious broadcasts on Sundays, all sorts of issues posed together. And it's a framework in which it's possible for political demands to be developed further as the struggle develops further. And secondly, it's a formula, it's a framework in which it's possible to start posing concretely and practically questions about workers' control of the economy. Because this is a form of organisation. Now, it's very interesting to note that the workers of El Alto in Bolivia demand that there should be a workers' assembly which should control, not only defend the city against attack by the right and by the army, but also should control the food supply. So immediately they're connecting together. We want an organisation which can really begin to, under our control, begin to organise all aspects of our life. In Gdansk in 1980, they took control of the local taxis and lorries. And no lorry or taxi moved without a pass from the strike committee. When the fleet came in from the fishing fleet came in from the Baltic, they ordered the canning factories to reopen to can the fish so that it wouldn't be spoiled. They told the trams and buses to start running again, and if you were in Gdansk at the time of the general strike in Gdansk, you saw the trams and buses still running, covered with Polish flags, and with slogans on them saying, "We are on strike, but we are working to make life easier for the strike committee," and for people in general. So you get this fantastic beginning of a sense of practical control of things, which of course enlarges workers' sense of their own capacities in the very practice of the struggle. Fourth point. and I just might make my 10 minutes. This is a very open form of democracy, with a fantastic capacity for development. It's the bridge, the best bridge that we have yet come across, that we've yet invented in our movement, for between here and workers' power, between here and workers' power in society. It's the bridge between the present struggle and the socialist future, because it's the democratic organisation of the struggle which prepares the way for the democratic organisation of society. It's if you like, it's practicing democracy in practice, as it were. Gramsci, the great Italian revolutionary, said about the factory councils in Italy, which were also part of the same tradition, that the socialist state, he put it, is already a potential within the institutions of the working class. The future form of workers' government is already being built in potential form inside the workers' council. Why? Firstly, because it overcomes the problem of the exclusion of the majority from interest and active participation in active political life, in self-government. In Poland, they talked about the autumn of 1981 being an orgy of participation. The Workers' Council formed, the Inter-Factory Strike Committee formed, the Solidarity form, as they called it, spread from the workers to the students. It spread to the peasants. 3 million peasants joined their own Solidarity organisation. It spread even to the stamp collectors of Poland, who reorganised the Stamp Collectors Club as the independent self-governing union of stamp collectors, Solidarity. Now, when the stamp collectors start to become, I don't know how many of you are stamp collectors, but when the stamp collectors start to reorganise themselves on a socialist basis, you know that things are beginning to change. It overcomes the exclusion also of large parts of social life from the sphere of democracy, so that questions about how should our cities be organised, how should our food supplies be organised, how should work be organised, who should boss us around at work, should we have bosses, should we elect our bosses, should they be bosses? All those questions can begin to be posed practically in the course of the race struggle, and in interesting ways sometimes. Again, Gdansk, 1980, the port workers discovered in the middle of their strike that 2 of their number had been stealing cigarettes from the bonded warehouse. And they had to decide what to do. They couldn't hand them over to the cops. You don't hand over strikers to the cops in the middle. On the other hand, they couldn't ignore it. In fact, very interestingly, workers are generally against theft in the middle of a great strike. And anyway, they couldn't give the police an excuse to come in. So what did they do? They decided they put them on trial themselves. They put the workers on trial and they found them guilty. In fact, the workers put their hands up. Yes, we did it. And they condemned them to stand on pallets for the afternoon, on a stack of pallets for the afternoon in the port with a notice round their neck saying thief. Now, it's better than ASBO's, I'll tell you, as a solution to the question of petty crime. And nobody would ever want to be in that situation, having to stand there. It sounds medieval, but it's curiously realistic and sensible as a product, a democratic product, democratic workers' justice. It's remarkably kind, too, Actually, one afternoon standing there with thief round your neck, and that's it. And everybody will, while all your mates laugh at you. The last thing is about it, of course, that it is the means, and this is crucial for us as revolutionists. It is the very means, it's the framework, the social framework and political framework in which the very thing that we talk about as the key to socialism, the self-emancipation of the working class, is actually going on as a process. There's a process of real transformation going on amongst people as they take control of their own lives in the process of struggle with the ruling class. That very thing that Marx talked about, the self-confidence of the human being, freedom, begins to be embodied in people's bodies, in their confidence, in their feelings about themselves, in their sense of their own capacities, and so on. There's what Rosa Luxemburg talked about when she talked about the mass strikes of the Russian workers in 1905, when she talked about the cultural and spiritual growth of the workers in the course of the struggle. That's absolutely vital, because one of the other things that the young Marx wrote was that one of the reasons you need a revolution, he said, is because there's no other way to get rid of what he called the muck of ages, or that sometimes some translations are the shit of ages. Whatever it is, the habit of subordination, the habit of crawling to the boss, the habit of feeling that you can't change the world, the thing that drives apathy, which is the sense of powerlessness, that is overcome precisely in the participation of the beginning of the self-government. And it changes people in all sorts of ways. There's one lovely story, and I'll probably overrun because I'm going to tell this story. In 1980 again, there was this, after the workers had won their victories, in the end of August 1980, there's this fantastic feeling running amongst the whole of the population of Poland. And it's reflected in curious ways. A doctor wrote a story in a Communist Party newspaper about how in her hospital, as the news came in of the workers' victories, people started discharging themselves from hospital against medical advice, saying, I feel better. It didn't, they might have a broken leg, bad liver, whatever it was, they felt better. And the hospital wards half emptied because people felt better. And then after a few more days, the wards started filling up again with another collection of patients. No, they weren't working people anymore. These were people who had titles like foreman, deputy party secretary and so on. They were feeling terrible. The whole balance of health and confidence in society shifted because of the success of the struggle. And it makes sense psychologically if you think about it. They were feeling terrible because their side was losing. For once our side was winning, and the workers were feeling fantastic. This is what Lenin meant when he talked about the festive energy of the working class in a revolution. Okay, so it's self-emancipation in practice. I'll end by saying this, though. Something we have to not just celebrate. This is not the end. The formation of workers' councils does not mean the end of politics. It doesn't mean it's really the beginning of politics, the real beginning of working class politics. It has to be democratic. It isn't a question of consensus, as some anarchists dream. This is a matter of furious arguments going on amongst workers about what's the way forward. And part of that argument is what are we going to do with this new body that we've created? Because now a crisis, when you create such institutions and they spread across the face of society, a crisis of the most extraordinary proportions is created in society. And the question which society is posed with is, do we march forward with these new institutions and transform everything with a slogan like all power to the workers' councils, or do we retreat? Do we, as the leader of, I've forgotten his name, the Bolivian leader says, wait for the next election to change things, or do we march forward now? Do we retreat? Do we compromise? Do we go forward? That becomes a vital question. And then the question is, who is there to argue the case for marching forward in a way that suits the tempo of the struggle, that fits what the minorities and the majorities inside the working class are? Look at the Bolsheviks in 1917. They proclaimed the slogan in April, all power to the Soviets, but it is not an agitational slogan, it's a propaganda slogan. What do I mean? Lenin's other slogan is, what do the Bolsheviks have to do? Patiently explain. For months, he says, patiently explain. We have to keep the argument going. That's the way forward when we've got the majority on our side. We have to win the majority to that perspective. When we know we've got the majority, we go for it. And that's what October is about. Finally, by September, they knew they were getting the majority, and they start preparing for the October insurrection, which is not so much an insurrection as a completion of a process, which was largely already completed amongst the Russian workers. But that becomes the crucial question, and unless there is an organisation there to argue that in that framework, that is clear about what the issues are, that knows how to listen to the different layers of workers, knows how to talk to them, knows how to listen to them, discuss with them, learn from them as well as teach them, then the whole thing can go down to defeat. And if it goes down to defeat, the ruling class, as we saw in Chile, can exert the most vicious and brutal revenge for the threat to its power. And therefore the question in the end of the Revolutionary Party comes absolutely to the fore in such a moment, in such periods. It is not, we have to, what is going on in Bolivia today reminds us that all those things that we saw as the great achievements of the working class in different countries in the 20th century are still on the agenda for the 21st century, more so than ever, more needed than ever. But the question is, will we have the organizations in the different countries able to talk to workers, listen to workers, learn from workers, organize with workers, reach out to wider and wider layers of workers to draw them into the struggle for a new society based on workers' councils. Thanks.